A lot of people reject the Bible on the grounds that the Gospels are not reliable. They say, well, Matthew wasn't really written by Matthew, the book of Mark wasn't really written by Mark, the Gospel of Luke was not written by Luke, and so forth. They point out that these books are technically anonymous, that we don't know who wrote them. They say that whoever wrote them were not eyewitnesses, and so forth and so on. I'd like to address those points because I believe those are invalid objections. First, I would argue that they were indeed written by eyewitnesses or people who were close to the eyewitnesses. I believe that they were indeed written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and I'll explain why in a moment. But second, even if they were not eyewitness accounts or close to them, that would not be sufficient grounds for rejecting them. Using that standard, we would have to reject virtually everything we know about ancient history. We would have to reject most of what Josephus or Tacitus wrote, for example. Because by and large, they were not eyewitnesses to the accounts that they wrote about. They might have witnessed some of those events, but certainly not all of them. It's simply not a fair standard by which to judge people. It would mean that you could not report accurately on the Civil War without drawing from accounts that were written by people who personally witnessed those events. No credible historian would accept that as valid grounds for rejecting the historical accounts. Now, even if the Gospels were completely anonymous, that still would not be sufficient grounds for rejecting them. It would still mean that somebody wrote about these events, and we would have to evaluate the totality of the evidence to see if these accounts are reliable, if they can be trusted, if they conform with known facts, and so forth. Now, as I mentioned, I believe that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John did indeed write these books. Why do I say that? First of all, 3 of those 4 books were attributed to relatively minor characters. Why would anyone write a gospel and then attribute it to Mark, for example? Or why would anyone falsely attribute the gospel to Mark? Mark is a very obscure New Testament character. He was known as traveling companion of Paul, and not a whole lot is said about him. He certainly did not command the great amounts of respect that, say, Peter would have. Same thing with Luke. Luke is mentioned 3 times. He's an obscure character. Why would he be mentioned at all? Well, why would he be given authorship of this book if indeed he was not the fellow who wrote it? Matthew was one of the apostles, but guess what? He was a notorious apostle. He was known primarily as a tax collector. If you mention Matthew, that's the number one thing most people would think about him. Tax collectors were badly hated in those days. It's unlikely that anyone would falsely attribute this gospel to Matthew in order to give it credibility. He's just an unlikely candidate. In fact, if you look at the later gospels that came out in later centuries, the Gnostic gospels, those that were falsely attributed to disciples, they were attributed to people like Peter and James and Thomas, more well-known characters. Peter in particular commanded great respect. He was a very prominent personality. So on those grounds, I think it's unlikely that these Gospels were written by anyone other than the minor characters after whom they were named. What about the Gospel of John? Now, John was a major player. He was one of the men in Jesus' inner circle, so that particular objection does not hold. He was a famous fellow. However, look at the way the Gospel is written. It mentions all of the other disciples except for one. One person that he refers to as the disciple whom Jesus loved. It mentions Matthew, it mentions Peter and company, but in place of John, he simply says the disciple whom Jesus loved. Why does he do that? Most likely because John is indeed the fellow who wrote it, and he wanted to avoid drawing attention to himself. He was being self-effacing. He wanted to emphasize the fact that, hey, he knew how much Jesus loved him, that Jesus died on the cross for him, gave his life for him, and he wanted to describe himself in those terms. He was being coy about himself. He wanted to avoid drawing attention to himself. I think that's the most consistent, most straightforward explanation of that fact. The early church was unanimous in attributing all 4 of these Gospels to the people who bore their names. That's another thing we should consider. They were much closer to those events than we were. They probably had information that's been lost to us, in the intervening centuries. So I'm inclined to trust their word on this matter. Moreover, the Gospels have pretty good historical accuracy. consider the Gospel of Luke, for example. Luke has an outstanding record for historical accuracy. It's a very detailed Gospel, and everything written in that Gospel jives very strongly with historical evidence. I like to cite the story of Sir William Ramsay. He's a famous archaeologist, someone with multiple doctorates, one of the greatest historians of all time, and he set out for the Bible land, for the Holy Land, in order to defend what is known as a Tübingen hypothesis, which said that the Gospel of Luke and its companion book, the Book of the Acts, were written in the 3rd century. In other words, centuries after the events. And he set out to prove that these books are not reliable. He set out to show that they were filled with all sorts of discrepancies. Well, after 15 years of searching and searching and searching, he was forced to reverse his opinion. Remember, this is a fellow who tried to disprove the reliability of Luke. And instead, after years of research, he came to the exact opposite conclusion. He said, Luke is a historian of the first rank. I'm quoting his words here. Not merely are his statements of fact trustworthy, he is possessed of the true historic sense. In short, this author should be placed along with the greatest of historians. That's how reliable Luke's Gospel is. We have abundant reason to trust the Gospels. By the way, in case you're still not convinced, consider the epistles of Paul. Some people contest the authorship of some of Paul's epistles, but several of them are not contested at all. And these attest to the resurrection, they attest to Paul's relationship with the disciples, and so forth and so on. 1 Corinthians 15, for example, is famous for having a short creed at the start, in which Paul basically says that the resurrection is real, and that Jesus manifested himself to many people, including himself, including James, the brother of Jesus, including the disciples themselves, and so forth and so on. He corroborates the core of the gospel accounts, the resurrection. In short, I think we have abundant reason to trust the gospel accounts. And I think that the objections raised to them on supposedly historical grounds are simply not valid.